This is topic 5, the last topic in module 1. In this topic we're going to look at post-structural or postmodern perspectives of play and pedagogy. We'll talk about that use of terminology in a minute. Post-structural and postmodern theories mostly stem from the work of Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. However, as with all of the theories presented in this unit so far, there are a range of others. And you'll have noticed in today's in the reading for this topic that the term postmodern is preferred by Albon. The EYLF talks about post-structural, and there is the tendency in the literature to use those terms interchangeably, although there is a subtle difference around them. Foucault, for instance, doesn't classify himself as a post-structuralist. He talks, or a postmodernist. He preferred to talk about the way that he was challenging modernity, not that he was post-modernity, but that he was contesting it. So the terminology, once again, is complex, and for the purposes of this unit and what we need to do, I'm just breaking it down and simplifying it a little bit. So going back to the early years learning framework, it says that the post-structural theories offer insights into issues of power, equity and social justice in early childhood. And so we'll look at how these two theories do that, and then in the tutorial online and on campus, we'll break that down a little bit, a little more practically for you in terms of how that plays out in early childhood settings. So we'll just look at some of the theories. So what is post-structural theory? Just reiterating that I'm using this term to cover all of the post theories. So that's post-modern theory, post-colonial theory, post-modern feminist theory, queer theory, and all of those things that get bound up in that umbrella term. So post-structuralists deny the possibility of an objective, stable and value-free set of beliefs. They challenge the basic tenets or foundations of universal laws, being able to escape from context, the transparency and neutrality of language, linear progression, ending in closure, and dualistic or either-or ways of thinking and relating to the world. Instead, knowledge is viewed as being socially constructed. Therefore, any notion of universal truths, one size fits all, laws and principles that can be applied to everyone are considered as misconstrued or challenged or rejected. Post-structural theorists recognise that any phenomena or experience is subjective, and therefore has multiple meanings and interpretations for the people experiencing that event at any point in time, and that these are influenced by social, historical, economical and political context in which they take place. Post-structural theory challenges the dominance of science and scientific approaches, such as developmental psychology, that apply universal laws, formulas and theoretical hypotheses, if you like, about the world, and particularly about children and education and care. There's an increasing number of scholars and educators in the early childhood field across many countries working in post-structural thinking, and their theories and concepts have begun to influence practice and research. Post-structural scholars today are drawing heavily on the foundational roots of French social and philosophical theory. In this case, we'll talk about Foucault and Bourdieu. There's also Derrida, and then there's the feminist work by Davies and Molkedine, and the post-colonial theory of Hegel, Sayed and Spivak. And these all come together in some of the writings and the work, certainly the readings that you had, the reading by Donna Albon that you have for this topic. So that's just a very brief and minimalist overview of what post-structuralist theory encompasses. Some key terms. It became evident last week that some of the terminology that I've assumed you may have come across before, you actually haven't necessarily. So I'll just unpack some of the key terms used in this topic. So discourses are systems of meaning that circulate through social life by individuals taking them up and speaking them as if they were their own. The discourses are the language of the topic or the language of the event or of what's happening. So, just thinking about the discourses of rugby league, for instance, there's certain lexicons, language, understandings that people have picked up. And if you came to Australia from another country, or if you had never heard anything about rugby league, you might find that discourse harder to access than somebody who's always been around it. But it's also about a discourse has another kind of implication in that it's been talked about for so long that it's been taken up, whether it's fact or fiction, and as by the general population or the general group involved in that phenomena as being so that it's become shared and understood as taken for granted. Knowledge has an interesting interpretation in sociocultural theory because it's mostly because of Bourdieu and Foucault's understanding of knowledge and power. But knowledge is historical, so all knowledge is created within a history or an historical frame, whether it's in the future or whether it's in the past. Knowledge is established, formed within a particular historical context. It's value laden, so somebody's knowledge, somebody has either developed that knowledge or you've developed it, you've come to some understandings yourself and you bring to those understandings your own values. So knowledge is value laden, it's context specific, meaning, not just locally, globally, across countries, but even, within a microcosm. Knowledge in one specific family might be different to the kind of knowledge that's in another family. They might not have exactly the same. So it's contextually specific, and because of the other area to the historical thing, it's culturally specific. And in sociocultural theory, it's always partial. So it's only part of the complete understanding that we might have. It has the potential to be normative. So my knowledge is of greater value than your knowledge. So my knowledge is right, and for you to be able to pass this course, for instance, this unit, I could take the position that you have to come back to me, write in your essays an understanding of this topic in exactly the same way as I have portrayed it. But of course that's not the case in this unit. The other thing is that knowledge and power are inextricably linked. So with knowledge comes power, with power comes knowledge. So again, these theorists don't disassociate the two. Deconstruction is an interesting concept, particularly associated with Gail Canella, post-structuralist, postmodernist. And she talks about reading social life as if it were a text. You've got to look for what's being said, what's not being said, and what messages are being sent and received in the spoken word of the social life, but the actual interactions, but also what's not happening and what's not being said. And the goal of deconstruction is to reveal inconsistencies, contradictions, and biases, and very importantly, so that you can reconstruct what's happening and in a more informed and enlightened way, if you like. And there's that word transformation again, which we came across in Freire's work in the last topic, and that's the act or process of changing conditions. And in terms of post-structuralists, that means looking at the status quo, the way things are, and if your critique or your deconstruction of social life sees some inconsistencies, contradictions, and biases, then you would take transformative action to reconstruct those conditions so that they were more just and equitable. Okay, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and social theorist. His theories addressed the relationship between power and knowledge and how they were used as a form of social control through various societal institutions. In particular, he points out that each society has its own regime of what is accepted as truth, that is, the types of discourses and language it accepts and makes function and what's considered true. According to this view, the language we use shapes and directs our way of looking at and understanding the world, rather than simply being a means of representing or copying reality. Seen from this perspective, language organises and governs our everyday experience of the world, as well as our ideas, thoughts, and actions in a particular way. Language can also create boundaries through processes of exclusion or inclusion. So if you don't understand the discourse of rugby league, if you can't access that conversation, then you can be excluded. And likewise, if you can join that conversation, then you can be included. So Foucault tells us, therefore, language can be used to empower or limit our thinking by directing how we view the world and hence our behaviours. Also, the language we use and the actions and practices we give prominence to can also inhibit alternative ways of understanding or interpreting the reality we experience. Foucault argues for thought as a form of criticism of all that we take for granted. Thought in this context refers to a form of criticism that enables us to question or deconstruct the way we view the world and our relation to it. As part of this exercise, the ways in which we think and behave can be challenged, the language changed, the behaviours altered, and boundaries reconstructed. To distance oneself from the taken for grantedness of our life experience will not be easy, but it is possible through a process of making problematic what we experience unquestioningly every day. So Foucault's asking us to use that post-structuralist lens. Do we just wander through our world accepting things the way we are, or do we problematize that from time to time?
Michel Foucault was one of the most influential thinkers in the social sciences and humanities during the latter part of the 20th century. He is best known for his critical studies on social institutions, including the human sciences, psychiatry, medicine, and especially the prison system. Foucault was born in Poitiers, France in 1926. His father and grandfather were both prominent physicians and hoped he would follow in their footsteps. When asked about growing up in German-occupied France, he stated, "I cannot experience pleasure. I have very early memories of an absolutely threatening world that could crush us. To have lived as an adolescent in a situation that had to end, that had to lead to another world, for better or for worse, was to have the impression of spending one's entire childhood at night waiting for dawn. That prospect of another world marked the people of my generation, and we have carried with us, perhaps to excess, a dream of apocalypse." While attending the prestigious college École Normale, he suffered from severe depression and started seeing a psychologist. This is where his interest in psychology and the social sciences began. After receiving the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in philosophy, he moved to Sweden to teach at the University of Uppsala. He submitted his doctoral thesis here, but it was rejected. He returned to France to finish his thesis and teach philosophy at Clermont-Ferrand. It was at this university that he met Daniel Defoe, who would become his longtime lover. After receiving his PhD, Foucault taught at a number of French universities, including the newly opened Paris 8, before settling down as Professor of the History of Systems of Thought, a self-appointed title, at the prestigious Collège de France. He would continue to lecture here over the next 20 years. Foucault took part in many political protests throughout the years and helped form the Prison Information Group as a way for prisoners to voice their concerns. He consistently stressed the need to restore the right of speech to groups silenced by their place in the structure of society. He began to spend more time in the United States, lecturing at universities including the University of Buffalo and UC Berkeley. In 1975, he took LSD at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley National Park, later calling it the best experience of his life. A central theme in Foucault's works is the struggle of the individual against the powers of society. Scholars say Foucault's new view on old philosophical questions, including insanity, social discipline, concepts of the human body, truth, and heterosexuality, helped form the foundation of what is now known as postmodern thought. In Foucault's first book, Madness and Civilization, he looks at the practices, institutions, and ideas associated with madness throughout Western society's history. His second book, Birth of the Clinic, looks at the history of the medical profession with a focus on the development of the clinical or teaching hospital. In it, he also discusses a term he coined, medical gaze, which refers to the way doctors view the patient's body as a separate entity from their personality. He argues this is dehumanizing and acts as another form of power over the individual. Discipline and Punish is often noted as Foucault's most influential book. It focuses on how the elite in society dominate and control the rest of society through disciplinary institutions, mainly prisons and schools. In order to dominate and have power, discipline must be used to regulate behavior of the individual. This regulation happens through many avenues, including the organization of spaces, such as the architecture of a building, and time, as in a classroom schedule. In the book, he also states his belief that no societal advances have been made since the Renaissance. The only thing to advance has been technology, and this new technology further enslaves the individual. Foucault did not spend a lot of time focusing on the subject of education, but he does say that school is an institution which teaches us how to use, and more importantly, respond to power. Foucault called schools normalizing institutions. If you think about it, schools are formed around educating large numbers of children, and secondary schools are regimented and institutional. Students are placed in classrooms where desks are usually lined up, facing the authority figure, the teacher, who stands up in front of the class, and the day is run by the ringing of the bell at specific times. Foucault's theories on power and control can be used as an argument against standardized testing in today's classrooms. Teachers are using rote styles of learning and retention for the tests, and facts are more important than concepts. From an educational psychology standpoint, standardized testing is a form of administrative control within the learning process. Foucault died of an AIDS-related illness in Paris on June 25, 1984. Prior to his death, he had destroyed most of his manuscripts, and in his will had prohibited the publication of what he might have overlooked.
Pierre Bourdieu was a French sociologist. He studied the ways in which social classes are organized and classified, and in particular how the educated social groups use cultural capital as a social strategy to hold or gain status and respect in society. Bourdieu's research has provided important ways of considering the relation of education to issues of how social groups are sustained and maintained, and the mechanisms through which social inclusion and exclusion are produced. He saw power as being created culturally and symbolically through the interaction between agency and structure, as an issue of socialisation against autonomy. His theory is characterised by the concepts of habitus, capital, field, and doxa. These are important concepts in understanding Bourdieu's theory, and they're outlined quite well in the following video.
Let's say that we have here the individual, and the individual enters into society, and society consists of a number of spaces. Society is a multidimensional space consisting of a number of subspaces or fields, and these could be any number of different contexts like institutions, social groups, workplaces. And while entering these spaces or fields, the individual always has with him or her the habitus. And the habitus are the resources, the combination of the amount and type of capital that the individual has. And this capital might be economic, money and such, or it can be social capital, like who you know and your networks, or it can be cultural capital, which is very important in Bourdieu's theory, having to do with knowing the right cultural codes, how to behave, and what works in various settings and contexts or in various fields. So all these forms of capital, economic, social, cultural, are transformed into symbolic capital, and that's an automatic process, and it happens when the individual enters into a field. So each field has its own rules or doxa. So the doxa are the rules for the field or space, and according to those rules, the social group at an aggregated level will evaluate the individual and ascribe him or her their position, their legitimate position in the field. So this means that when you study mentoring, it's very easy to identify spaces or fields like these and to analyse them in terms of practice. So studying social practice, what people do, for example, in a mentoring scenario, will make it possible to observe things that kind of that we can then conceptualize in terms of habitus, capital, field, doxa, and so on.
Bourdieu used these concepts to interrogate how different social groups vie for and acquire power within societies. Like Foucault, Bourdieu is interested in showing that knowledge is a social fact that should undergo social inquiry because knowledge bears a relationship to the social position of the knowers. The implications of these theories for play and pedagogy are quite significant and growing. So taking a post-structural perspective means believing that there are multiple and contested ways of learning. This means knowledge is positioned as relative, not fixed by a reference to a positive construction of reality. So post-structuralist perspectives really speak back to developmental perspectives that say things happen in certain sequential locked stages. They contest that way of learning and that way of knowing. And of course, in the Educator's Guide, it was interesting to note the actual comment between critical theory and post-structural theory doesn't change. They're both talking about, it says the same thing for both. And because post-structural theory is emanates out of critical theory, it is in the critical frame, I guess that's not surprising either. So this is very brief, and I've inserted those videos so that you get perhaps another perspective of what these theories are, and so that we can talk about that a little bit more in the tutorials. Once again, I've included a list of the references that I've drawn on in this presentation.